Gather round, star wanderers, and let me tell you a tale that changed the very fabric of galactic politics. A story still whispered with amusement in the grand halls of the collective and taught to younglings of 1,000 species. This is not merely history, but legend, the account of how the mighty Sslithik, rulers of galactic governance for 12 generations, were toppled by a single human with nothing more than wit, audacity, and what humans call a smart mouth. Lean closer now, for the telling is in the details. The Galactic Governance Competition had been established 8 millennia ago as a supposedly meritocratic method of determining which species would hold the 5 coveted seats on the Central Governance Council, the body that established interstellar law, mediated disputes between star nations, and controlled access to the most valuable resources in known space. In theory, the competition tested the qualities most valuable in galactic leadership: diplomatic acumen, technological innovation, ethical reasoning, cultural adaptability, and governance philosophy. In practice, the Sslithik had manipulated the competition for over 700 years, maintaining their dominant position through a combination of physiological advantages, strategic alliances, and shameless cheating. The lizard-like Sslithik, with their photographic memories, natural capacity for multitasking with bifurcated brains, and specialized organs that detected deception in other species, had created a competition that played perfectly to their strengths while handicapping everyone else. Their central councillor, Grand Councilor Hassrassk, had famously declared that lesser species should be grateful for Sslithik guidance, as hatchlings are grateful for the shell that protects them. Then came the expansion protocols, which required the Governance Council to extend competition invitations to newly discovered spacefaring civilizations, and thus Earth received its first invitation, a formality the Sslithik assumed would lead to a humiliating failure that would keep humans subservient for centuries. The invitation arrived at United Earth Diplomatic Headquarters on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, footage of Grand Councilor Hassrassk mockingly describing humans as barely evolved primates, still dragging their knuckles across primitive touchscreens, had gone viral across Earth's networks. By Wednesday morning, the United Earth Security Council had made their unprecedented decision. They would send Zenovia Blackwell. "Let me get this straight," Zenovia Blackwell said, leaning back in her chair until it creaked ominously. "You want me, the diplomat who was suspended last month for telling the Centaurian ambassador his proposal was weapons-grade stupid, to represent humanity in a contest that determines our species' place in galactic civilization for the next 100 years? Director Okafor of the Diplomatic Corps pinched the bridge of his nose, a gesture Zen had noticed correlated precisely with her presence in his office. "The Security Council believes your unique approach is exactly what we need in this situation. My unique approach is telling self-important blowhards that they're self-important blowhards. How does that help?" Ambassador Wong, seated beside Okafor, leaned forward. "Because the Sslithik are the galaxy's most self-important blowhards, and they've structured this entire competition as elaborate theater. It's not really about governance skills. It's about maintaining the appearance of legitimacy while ensuring their continued dominance." Zen raised an eyebrow. "So you want me to, flip over the game board?" "Essentially, yes," Okafor admitted. "Our analysts believe conventional diplomatic approaches will fail because the system is rigged. We need someone who can think outside the traditional boundaries. Someone who doesn't give a flying photon about hierarchical structures or diplomatic niceties," Wong added. "Someone who can't be intimidated by beings with fancy titles and superiority complexes," Okafor continued. "Someone who once told the President of United Earth that his ceremonial robe made him look like, and I quote, a disco ball that mated with a bathrobe." Wong finished with the ghost of a smile. Zen crossed her arms. At 38, she was considered young for a senior diplomat. Her dark hair cut in a practical bob that framed a face more often set in skeptical amusement than diplomatic neutrality. Her record was a bizarre mixture of spectacular successes and protocol violations that would have ended anyone else's career. "The competition starts in 3 weeks, Okafor said. You'll have complete access to all our information on Sslithik culture, biology, and governance philosophy. We're also assembling a support team of xenobiologists, game theorists, and cultural specialists. And what exactly makes you think I can win an impossible game against literal space lizards who've been running it for centuries? Ambassador Wong smiled fully then, sliding a data tablet across the desk. It displayed the viral footage of Grand Councilor Hassrassk dismissing humanity alongside a psychological profile, because nothing motivates you more than proving arrogant authority figures wrong. Zen picked up the tablet, studying the Sslithik leader's smug, scaled face. Well, she said finally, his ceremonial robe does make him look like a rejected design from a budget reptile costume shop. Okafor sighed. Is that a yes? I'll need unrestricted communication privileges, diplomatic immunity for anything short of actual violence, and a really good coffee machine on my transport. Done, Wong said immediately. Then, yes, let's go embarrass some lizards. The Galactic Hub made Earth's orbital stations look like children's toys, a massive construct located at the gravitational balance point between 3 star systems. It housed representatives from over 400 species and served as the physical headquarters for the Governance Council. As Zen's diplomatic shuttle approached, the structure's true scale became apparent. A central sphere 50 kilometers in diameter, surrounded by rotating rings housing different atmospheric zones, governmental sections, and cultural enclaves. The Sslithite dominance was visually obvious, their architectural influence marked by distinctive hexagonal patterns and green-gold color schemes that dominated the central sphere. Gods and void, muttered Dr. Ekaterina Volkov, the xenobiologist assigned to Zen's support team. It's like they've built a physical manifestation of their superiority complex. Compensating for something, probably, Zen replied, adjusting the collar of her formal diplomatic uniform. The one concession she'd made to protocol. Small cloacas, perhaps? Captain Kwame Osei, their military attaché and security officer, unsuccessfully tried to disguise his laugh as a cough. Director Okafor warned me about you. All good things, I'm sure. Zen gathered her minimal personal effects as the shuttle docked. Remember, no matter what happens in there, look unimpressed. The Sslithik feed on others' awe. Don't give them the satisfaction. The reception committee waiting at the airlock was calculated for maximum intimidation. 4 Sslithik in ceremonial armor, flanking a tall, elaborately robed figure with exceptional green-gold scales that caught the light with every movement. The Sslithik guards stood over 2 meters tall, their powerful tails perfectly still in disciplined posture. Their ceremonial armor, iridescent metal plates arranged in the inevitable hexagonal pattern, was clearly designed more for show than function, but the plasma staffs they carried looked decidedly functional. Each guard's throat sac pulsed slightly with controlled breathing, while their multifaceted eyes constantly scanned the human delegation with predatory focus. Behind the guards stood various hub functionaries from a dozen species, all watching with varying degrees of curiosity and condescension as the humans arrived. A tall, willowy being with luminous tendrils instead of hair whispered something to a short, stocky creature whose rock-like skin glistened with moisture. Both glanced at the humans and made gestures that needed no translation. Dismissive amusement. Under Councilor Zisk, Volkov whispered, 3rd in their hierarchy. The Under-Councilor's robes were a marvel of ostentatious design. Layer upon layer of shimmering material that shifted color depending on viewing angle, embedded with what appeared to be status markers and ceremonial symbols. A complex headdress framed their elongated skull, emphasizing the impressive crest that marked high steady Sslithik. Even their claws had been decorated with metallic sheaths that clicked subtly against each other when they moved their 4-fingered hands. Zen stepped forward before the Sslithik could speak. Under-Councilor, how delightful that they sent you to meet us. I was worried they'd just send maintenance staff, which would better align with how your Grand Councilor described our significance. The Sslithik's multifaceted eyes narrowed, vertical pupils contracting to slits. Representative Blackwell, your grasp of our language is unexpected. Oh, I'm full of surprises, Zen smiled brightly. Like knowing that in Sslithik culture, meeting a newly arrived species representative is typically done by someone at least second tier in the hierarchy, not third. But I understand if your superiors had more important things to do, basking lamps to attend to perhaps. A ripple passed through the Sslithik guards, the equivalent of a shocked murmur. Under Councillor Zisk's throat sac, briefly inflated, a sign of agitation they couldn't quite suppress. You will be shown to your accommodation sector, they said stiffly. The preliminary orientation begins in 3 standard hours. Do not be late. As they were escorted through the vast corridors of the hub, Zen maintained a running commentary just loud enough for the Sslithik guards to hear. Interesting architectural choice, very obvious. Oh, look, another hexagon. How creative. Is that supposed to be art, or did someone have an accident with the maintenance systems? Captain Osai leaned close. You're antagonizing them deliberately. I'm establishing that we won't be intimidated, Zen replied quietly. The Sslithik respect strength and despise perceived weakness. Every species that approaches them with reverence gets systematically dominated. And your strategy is what? To annoy them into submission? Zen grinned. My strategy is to make them underestimate me while simultaneously making them emotional. Sslithik pride themselves on cold logic. When they get emotional, they make mistakes. Their accommodation sector proved to be a barely adequate suite of rooms, with atmospheric controls clearly calibrated for reptilian comfort rather than mammalian preferences. The ceiling was unnecessarily high, the temperature sweltering, and the humidity low enough to make human skin crack within hours. How hospitable, Zen remarked, immediately locating the environmental controls and resetting them. Let's get to work. We have 3 hours to review the orientation protocols, and I want to prepare some special surprises for our scaly hosts. The preliminary orientation took place in an enormous amphitheater with representatives from 28 species, all the current competition participants. The Sslithik representatives occupied a central dais, with Grand Councilor Hassrassk himself presiding. His scales were particularly luminous, enhanced by what Zen recognized as cosmetic treatments and strategic lighting designed to create a halo effect around his impressive crest. As the only humans in attendance, Zen's team was assigned seating in the furthest and highest section, requiring them to look up at the Sslithik, another calculated psychological tactic. Zen promptly ignored her assigned seat and walked directly to the front row, settling herself comfortably before anyone could object. After a moment's hesitation, Volkov and Osei joined her. That seat is reserved for the Dralaxian delegation, hissed an aide with vibrating antennae. How fascinating, Zen replied, not moving. Perhaps they can use our assigned seats, since hierarchy of seating seems so important in this supposedly equal competition. The commotion attracted Hassrassk's attention, the Grand Councilor's gaze fixed on the human delegation, his throat sac expanding slightly in irritation before he mastered himself. The representatives of participating species, his amplified voice filled the chamber. Welcome to the 823rd Galactic Governance Competition. For 8 millennia, this sacred tradition has determined which species possess the wisdom, temperament, and ability to guide our collective civilization. Zen raised her hand high, wiggling her fingers like an enthusiastic schoolchild. After attempting to ignore her for several uncomfortable moments, Hassrassk finally acknowledged her. The human representative has a query? Not a query, just a correction, Zen said cheerfully. It's actually the 824th competition. The historical records archived in your public database clearly document the competition that took place during the quantum disruption period, which your introduction appears to have skipped. Simple oversight, I'm sure. Please continue. A ripple of murmurs passed through the assembled representatives. Hassrassk's scales briefly darkened, a sign of embarrassment or anger. As I was saying, he continued stiffly, the competition consists of 5 challenges, each testing a crucial aspect of governance capability. For the next hour he outlined the competition structure, emphasizing the glorious Sslithik tradition of winning the Central Council seat for 7 consecutive centuries. Throughout his speech, Zen maintained an expression of polite interest while tapping notes into her datapad. The first challenge begins tomorrow, Hassrassk concluded. May wisdom guide your efforts, though history suggests the outcome is, he paused, multifaceted eyes sweeping meaningfully across the non-Sslithik representatives, predictable. As the assembly dispersed, Zen made a point of approaching the Sslithik dais directly. Several guards moved to intercept her, but Hassrassk waved them aside, curiosity apparently overriding protocol. Grand Councilor, Zen smiled broadly. Such an informative presentation. I particularly enjoyed learning how the challenges have been modified over the centuries to, as you put it, reflect evolving governance needs. Fascinating how those modifications consistently aligned with Sslithik physiological advantages. Hassrassk's throat sac expanded fully, a warning display. You imply bias, human? Emply? No, Zen's smile never faltered. I'm stating it directly. But don't worry, I don't blame you. If I had to compete on actual merit, I'd rig the system too. Before the stunned councillor could respond, Zen turned and walked away, her posture relaxed, as if she'd just commented on the weather rather than delivered an unprecedented diplomatic insult. Captain, she said quietly to Osai as they exited. How many of the other species representatives were watching that exchange? All of them, he replied, looking slightly pale. Director Okafor is going to have an aneurysm when he hears about this. Good. Phase 1 complete. You've already moved to executing phases of a plan? Volkov asked, hurrying to keep pace. The plan is simple, Zen explained. First, make the Sslithik underestimate me while simultaneously making them furious. Second, demonstrate to the other species that someone is finally calling out the system's corruption. Third, win through methods so unexpected that they can't possibly prepare countermeasures. And how exactly do you plan to win rigged challenges designed specifically for Sslithik physiology? Zen's smile turned predatory, by making the very things they consider human weaknesses into our greatest strengths. The first challenge, described as a test of diplomatic acumen, took place in a massive holographic simulation chamber. Each species representative was required to navigate a complex negotiation scenario involving multiple parties with conflicting interests. The scenario was clearly designed to favor the Sslithik's bifurcated brains, which allowed them to simultaneously process multiple conversation threads and their deception-detecting organs, which gave them insight into other negotiators' true intentions. When Zen entered the chamber for her turn, she found herself in a simulated council meeting with holographic representatives of 8 fictional species, all with tangled territorial disputes and resource conflicts requiring resolution. Representative Blackwell, announced the disembodied voice of the judge, you have 1 standard hour to achieve consensus among all parties. Your performance will be evaluated on the stability and fairness of any resulting agreement. The simulation began, and immediately the 8 representatives started speaking simultaneously, each presenting demands and grievances in deliberately overwhelming fashion. Zen listened for precisely 30 seconds, then put 2 fingers in her mouth and produced a whistle so piercing that the holographic representatives actually flinched. New rules, she announced into the startled silence. Everyone shuts up. 1 at a time, each of you gets 2 minutes to state your absolute minimum requirements, not your demands, not your wish list, just what you absolutely must have. After everyone speaks, I'll present a unified solution. Anyone who interrupts loses their turn. Starting with you, she pointed to the being on her left. The simulation hadn't been programmed for this approach, and the holographic representatives seemed momentarily confused before adapting to the unexpected structure. As each representative spoke, Zen took minimal notes, her focus more on their body language and emotional cues than their specific words. When everyone had spoken, she stood and approached the central holographic display showing the disputed territories. With swift, confident gestures, she completely reorganized the map. Here's the solution. The Zoraxians get the outer mineral belt, but the Fenderlites get processing priority and a 15% resource share. The Uvexians get the northern continent, but with protected migration corridors for the Drell that include seasonal hunting rights. The Tassa get exclusive development rights to the oceanic zones in exchange for providing atmospheric regulation technology to all parties. She continued for several minutes, addressing each conflict with solutions that satisfied core needs while requiring everyone to compromise on peripheral demands. When she finished, 7 of the 8 representatives indicated acceptance. The 8th, a warlike species with pride issues clearly modeled on the Sslithik themselves, pounded the table. Unacceptable! We deserve more territory as the militarily superior power. Zen smiled sweetly. Interesting perspective. Here's my counter-proposal. Accept the agreement as outlined, or I recommend to all other parties that they form a defensive alliance specifically targeting your territories. Your military superiority becomes irrelevant against a united opposition with shared intelligence and coordinated defense systems. Your choice. After a moment of tense silence, the 8th representative grudgingly indicated acceptance. The simulation froze, and the judge's voice returned. Simulation complete, results processing. When Zen exited the chamber, she found the actual competition viewing area in an uproar. Representatives from various species were gesticulating and arguing with the Sslithik judges. Grand Councilor Hassrassk's scales had darkened to a deep olive color, a sign of extreme agitation. What happened? She asked Captain Osai, who was unsuccessfully trying to hide a grin. You completed the negotiation in 17 minutes. The previous record was 43 minutes, held by Under Councilor Zisk. The Sslithik are trying to claim your approach violated the spirit of diplomatic process, but there's nothing in the actual rules against restructuring the negotiation format. And the other species? Most are delighted. A few are suspicious about whether a human could actually perform that well without cheating. Zen nodded. Phase 2 progressing nicely then? What's the next challenge? Over the next 3 days, Zen systematically dismantled the Sslithik's carefully constructed competition advantages. In the Technological Innovation Challenge, rather than presenting advanced hardware, where Sslithik photographic memory of technical specifications gave them an edge, she demonstrated a remarkably simple algorithm for optimizing resource distribution that could be implemented on any system, regardless of technological level. For the Ethical Reasoning Challenge, designed to favor the Sslithik's supposedly superior analytical thinking, she rejected the abstract philosophical framework entirely and instead told personal stories that humanized the consequences of various ethical approaches, appealing to the emotional intelligence that most species possessed, but the Sslithik undervalued. With each unexpected success, 2 things happened. The Sslithik became increasingly desperate, and the other competing species became increasingly supportive of the human approach. Attempts at sabotage soon followed. Zen's accommodations suffered mysterious environmental control malfunctions. Her competition materials were accidentally erased. A suspicious food contamination incident was narrowly avoided thanks to Dr. Volkov's handheld analyzer. None of it dampened Zen's irreverent approach. If anything, she became more outrageous, arriving at the 4th challenge wearing a small decorative pin shaped like a terrestrial lizard with the caption, "Original model," clearly visible. By the time the final challenge arrived, the competition had transformed from a ceremonial coronation of Sslithik superiority into the most hotly contested governance selection in centuries. Representatives from species who had competed merely as a formality for generations were now actively engaged and openly critical of the Sslithik's manipulations. The final challenge, testing governance philosophy, was traditionally a formal presentation before the assembled representatives and current council members. Each competitor presented their species' approach to governance, emphasizing aspects meant to impress the predominantly Sslithik judges. In an unprecedented move, Grand Councilor Hassrassk himself announced he would present the Sslithik philosophy personally, rather than delegating to a lower representative. His presentation was masterful, a comprehensive overview of the Sslithik's hierarchical meritocracy, their emphasis on logical decision-making, and their benevolent guidance of less developed species. Every statement was calculated to reinforce the impression of Sslithik natural superiority while maintaining a veneer of inclusive magnanimity. When it was Zen's turn to present, she approached the central platform empty-handed, without the elaborate visual aids or prepared statements used by other representatives. "Distinguished representatives," she began, her voice calm but carrying perfectly through the chamber. "I had prepared an extensive presentation on human governance philosophy with historical examples, theoretical frameworks, and practical applications." She paused, looking directly at Hassrassk. "But given the events of the past week, I've decided to demonstrate human governance philosophy rather than simply talking about it." A murmur ran through the audience as Zen activated the central display system. Instead of a formal presentation, she showed documentation of every rule manipulation, procedural irregularity, and subtle sabotage the Sslith had employed during the competition, not just against humans, but against all participating species over many years. "Human governance philosophy begins with transparency," she continued as damning evidence scrolled behind her. "It continues with accountability." More documents appeared, these showing the systematic advantages the Sslithik had built into each challenge, and it emphasizes adaptability. The display shifted to show her various, unconventional solutions to the rigged challenges. "But most importantly," Zen said, her voice growing stronger, "human governance philosophy recognizes that true authority comes not from tradition, not from physical or mental attributes, but from the trust of those being governed." She turned to face the assembled representatives directly. "The Sslithik have maintained control, not through superior governance skills, but through systematic manipulation of the very process meant to test those skills. They've substituted actual governance with theatrical performance, substance with spectacle." Grand Councilor Hassrassk surged to his feet, throat sac fully inflated in rage. "This is slander. The human presents manipulated evidence in a desperate attempt to discredit our legitimate achievements." "The evidence is drawn directly from the Hub's own archived records," Zen replied calmly, "and I've provided access codes for any representative to verify the originals. Transparency, remember? This is not governance philosophy," Hassrassk spluttered. "This is accusation without the proper procedural—" "Actually," Zen interrupted, "responding to systemic injustice through direct action is a core element of human governance philosophy. We call it speaking truth to power. And sometimes," she smiled, "we call it flipping the table when the game is rigged." She turned back to the assembled representatives. "I am not here to claim humans should hold the Central Council's seat. I am here to demonstrate that the current selection process is fundamentally corrupted and requires complete reformation, with input from all species, not just those who've manipulated their way to the top." For a moment the chamber was absolutely silent. Then, from the back, a representative of the Dralaxians, one of the oldest spacefaring species, stood. "We support the human proposal for reformation of the selection process." Another representative stood, then another. Within minutes, representatives from 23 species had expressed support. Hassrassk's scales had now faded to a sickly yellow-grey. "This is unprecedented. There are procedures, traditions." "Yes," Zen agreed, "and they've served your species very well while failing everyone else. That ends today." The final vote wasn't even close. By overwhelming majority, the assembled representatives approved the formation of a multi-species commission to restructure the governance competition, with the current results nullified pending the new system's implementation. As an interim measure, a temporary council was established, with representatives chosen by random selection from qualified species, a system that, by pure chance, or perhaps cosmic irony, resulted in a human being selected for one of the 5 seats. It was not Zenovia Blackwell. She had explicitly removed herself from consideration, stating that her role was to flip the table, not to set a new one. And so, Star Wanderers, the reign of the Sslithik ended not with war or revolution, but with sarcasm and exposed truth. The lizard-like beings who had dominated galactic politics for 7 centuries found themselves relegated to equal status among the community of species, their carefully constructed facade of superiority shattered beyond repair. The new governance selection process, implemented 2 standard years after what became known as the Blackwell Reformation, established rotating qualification tournaments with randomized challenge parameters and multi-species judging panels. Rather than a single competition determining seats for a century, the council positions rotated more frequently, ensuring fresh perspectives and preventing any species from becoming entrenched in power. Perhaps most revolutionary was the establishment of the Oversight Committee, a randomly selected group of representatives from non-council species who monitored council decisions for bias and maintained transparency in governance procedures. This innovation, directly inspired by Zenovia Blackwell's approach, became the cornerstone of the new galactic political system. Some say Grand Councilor Hassrassk never recovered from the humiliation. His scales reportedly never regained their lustrous green-gold sheen, fading to a permanent grayish hue that in Sslithik culture signifies loss of status. He eventually retreated to an ancestral estate on the Sslithik homeworld, where he reportedly wrote a bitter memoir titled The Mammalian Menace that no reputable publisher would touch. As for Zenovia Blackwell, she declined all offers of prestigious diplomatic positions, preferring to return to Earth, where she established what became known as the Transparency Initiative, an organization dedicated to training diplomats from all species in the art of, as she put it, calling out bureaucratic nonsense across the galaxy. When asked years later if she had entered the competition with a specific plan to overthrow the Sslithik, she famously replied, "Plan? No, I just have a low tolerance for pretentious reptiles. The revolution was improvised." Remember this tale when facing those who claim superiority based on tradition alone. For as the humans say, sometimes all it takes to change the galaxy is one person willing to state that the emperor, or in this case, the lizard, has no clothes.